The first autumn storm of the season had not yet struck Harlow Park, and already the drawing room felt like a cage. Eliza Fenwick stood at the edge of the cream-papered room with a glass of lemonade she had not been offered and would not drink, her back to the cold window where the first heavy drops struck glass in irregular beats. 30 guests had gathered for the Duke of Harlow's annual shooting party, and every one of them knew exactly who belonged and who did not. She was Mrs. Bertram's companion. She was there to fetch shawls, to pour tea, to read aloud when the old woman's eyes grew tired, and to occupy no more space than the task required. The gown she wore was 2 seasons old, dove gray, the hem let down once, and pressed carefully so the crease would not show. Around her, the room was a constellation of silk and garnets, and the low, confident laughter of people who had never pressed a crease. If this story already feels like one you need, stay close. It has not begun to show you what it holds. Lady Constance Ashworth, the Dowager Duchess of Harlow, stood near the mantelpiece in plum velvet and a collar of seed pearls that caught the candlelight each time she turned her chin, which was often. She had positioned Miss Georgiana Price at her left elbow with the precision of a general staging artillery, and Georgiana occupied the position with the serene confidence of a woman who had been told since girlhood that she was the answer to a question the world had already agreed to ask. She was beautiful. She was an earl's daughter. She was 20 and accomplished and fair, and she laughed at precisely the moments Lady Constance expected her to laugh. Eliza watched her from across the room the way one watches weather forming on a horizon one cannot leave. "Mrs. Bertram's little companion," Lady Constance said, leaning toward Georgiana without lowering her voice, as though Eliza were a clock on the wall whose ticking did not require discretion. "She reads aloud tolerably, I am told. One supposes that is something." Georgiana's smile did not falter. She did not glance at Eliza. She did not need to. The Duke of Harlow entered through the south doors, at the precise moment the wind shifted against the house, and the candles nearest the doorway guttered and then recovered. Henry Ashworth was 31, and looked older in the way that men who carry private weight look older, not in the face exactly, which was cut clean along the jaw and set with gray eyes the color of slate after rain, but in the stillness of his carriage, as though something inside him had learned years ago to stop reaching. He crossed the room without greeting anyone in particular, accepted a glass from the footman Thomas without looking at it, and stopped. Eliza did not see the stop. She was watching the rain. She did not know that his gaze had found her gray dress among the silks, the careful press of her hem, the way she held the lemonade glass with both hands as though it were a small, warm creature she was protecting from the room. She did not know that his jaw shifted once, a movement so slight that only a man's valet or a careful narrator would have caught it, and that his eyes stayed on her 4 seconds longer than rank permitted before he turned away. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruise, and the oaks along the south drive had begun to lean. Eliza Fenwick had not always been a companion. 2 years earlier, she had been Miss Fenwick of Ashmore, the only daughter of a country parson with a modest living and an immodest library. Her father had read Greek before breakfast, quoted Cowper at supper, and died on a Tuesday morning in March, with £2,000 of debt folded neatly inside his writing desk, each creditor's name in his own careful hand, as though the list itself were a form of penance. The living reverted to the bishop. The cottage reverted to the parish. The library was sold in lots at auction, and Eliza had watched the books go one by one from the doorway of the empty parlor, with her hands at her sides and her face perfectly still, because she had already learned that the body will hold its shape long after the life inside it has changed. She had kept one book, a small leather-bound volume of verse that had belonged to her mother, its pages soft as cloth, with 3 pressed violets between the leaves and her mother's maiden name written on the flyleaf in an ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. The book lived in the pocket of whatever dress she wore, and she touched it sometimes without meaning to, the way a sailor touches the rail. Mrs. Bertram had hired her on the strength of a letter from the bishop's wife, and for 2 years Eliza had read aloud, poured tea, fetched shawls, and perfected the art of being present without being noticed. £40 per annum. A room on the 3rd floor with a view of the kitchen garden. It was enough. It was not a life, precisely, but it was the shape a life takes when there is no other shape available, and she had learned to fill it without complaint. The invitation to Harlow Park had been Mrs. Bertram's, of course. Mrs. Bertram was a distant cousin of the late Duke, and clung to the connection with the genial tenacity of a woman who believed proximity to title was a form of accomplishment. Eliza was there because Mrs. Bertram could not manage the stairs without an arm to lean on, could not dress without fingers younger than her own, and could not sleep without a voice reading Fordyce's sermons in the dark, which Eliza did every night with a patience that required no acting because she had come to love the old woman despite the sermons. Lady Constance had acknowledged Mrs. Bertram with warmth, and Eliza with a single glance that moved from the dove-gray hem to the unadorned throat and found nothing worth a second assessment. The household had followed the dowager's lead. Eliza ate at the far end of the table, walked at the rear of the party, and occupied the smallest chair in the drawing-room with the careful invisibility of someone who understands that visibility, in her position, is a kind of debt she cannot afford. She did not mind. She told herself she did not mind. On the second evening, the storm that had been building over the Somerset hills arrived with a sound like canvas tearing. Rain struck the windows of Harlow Park in sheets so heavy that the glass seemed to flex inward, and the old house groaned at its joins as the wind found every crack the years had opened. The guests retreated to the upstairs drawing-room and the card tables, the ladies clutching at their sleeves with a theatrical alarm that was also partly genuine, and the servants moved through the lower floors with candles and oilcloth, checking the casements. By 10 o'clock, the south drive was a river of mud. The stables had lost a section of roof, and the head groom had reported that no carriage would leave or arrive before the roads dried. They were sealed in. Eliza could not sleep. Mrs. Bertram had taken her laudanum drops and was snoring with a gentleness that seemed improbable from such a small frame, and the wind against the 3rd-floor window had a pitch that made Eliza's teeth ache. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders, slipped her mother's book of verse into her pocket, and went downstairs to the library. She did not expect to find anyone. The library at Harlow Park was a long room on the ground floor with windows that overlooked the kitchen garden. And at this hour, it should have been dark. It was not dark. A single lamp burned on the table near the fireplace, and in its circle of light sat the Duke of Harlow with a glass of brandy he had not touched, and a letter he was not reading. He looked up when she opened the door, and for one unguarded moment his face held an expression she could not name, something between relief and alarm, as though he had been waiting for someone, and she was both the wrong person and the right one. "Forgive me, Your Grace." She stepped back. "I did not know the room was occupied." "Stay." The word came out low, not quite a command, not quite a request. He seemed to hear it himself and adjusted. "The fire is lit. You may as well make use of it." She should have left. Every rule governing her position, her sex, her lack of chaperone, and her utter absence of standing in this house told her to close the door and climb the stairs and lie awake, listening to the wind. She stayed. She crossed to the far end of the long room, chose a chair near the second window, and opened her mother's book of verse. to a page she knew by heart. The pressed violet between the leaves shifted as the spine cracked, and she caught it with her fingertip and pressed it flat again. He did not speak. She did not speak. The fire muttered between them. The rain hammered. 20 minutes passed before the cry came from the corridor, thin and high, and Eliza was on her feet before the sound had resolved into a word. She found the kitchen girl, Nell, 11 years old and slight as a wren, standing barefoot in the stone passage outside the library, with her arms wrapped around her own ribs and her face wet. A shutter had broken loose in the servants' corridor, and the wind had come through the gap with a violence that had thrown the girl from her cot. Eliza knelt. She did not touch the child immediately. She held her own hands still, palms up, and waited until Nell reached for them, and then she pulled the girl against her shoulder and said, "You are safe. The house is old and cross and making a terrible fuss about the rain. That is all." She did not know the Duke had followed her to the doorway. She did not see him standing with one hand on the frame, watching her rock the girl and smooth the hair from her forehead and speak in a voice so low and steady that it seemed to slow the wind itself. She did not see the moment his grip on the doorframe tightened, the knuckles going white, as though the image of a woman kneeling on cold stone to hold a frightened child had struck something inside him that he had believed was beyond striking. He stepped forward. "Nell, come inside where the fire is." It was not a request. Nell looked up, startled to find the Duke 2 feet from her, and something in the level certainty of his voice moved her legs before her fear could object. Eliza guided the girl to the chair nearest the fire, wrapped her own shawl around the thin shoulders, and sat beside her. The Duke stood at the mantelpiece. He did not leave. He watched Eliza read aloud to the child from the small leather-bound book, her voice low and unhurried, turning the pages with a hand that was entirely steady. And something in his face began to change. Not visibly. Not in any way the room would have caught. Something behind the face, a lock turning that the world could not hear. That the storm did not relent. Nell fell asleep in the library chair with her knees drawn up and Eliza's shawl pulled to her chin, and Eliza sat beside her until the girl's breathing leveled and the fire had burned to its last orange coal. When she finally rose to leave, she found a blanket had been laid across the arm of the empty chair where the Duke had been sitting, folded once with a military precision that was not the work of a servant. She did not look at the chair. She lifted Nell in both arms, carried her through the cold corridor to the servants' stairs, and delivered her to the cook's room, where the older woman received the child without surprise, as though companions regularly appeared in the small hours carrying kitchen girls. Eliza climbed the stairs to her own room, and her hands shook only when she closed the door, and there was no one to see it. The next morning, the Duke passed her in the breakfast room and said nothing. He held the door for her as she entered, a gesture so small it might have been mechanical, except that he did not hold it for Georgiana, who entered 2 steps behind. He asked Mrs. Bertram whether her room was warm enough and whether her companion had everything she required, and the word companion landed differently in his mouth than it did in Lady Constance's, stripped of its diminishment, returned to its plain meaning. Mrs. Bertram said yes, and Eliza kept her eyes on the toast and felt the question land in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. At luncheon, his hand brushed the back of her chair as he passed, and the contact lasted less than a second, and her spine recorded it for the rest of the afternoon. By the 3rd morning, the guests at Harlow Park had settled into the irritable intimacy of confinement, and the drawing room after breakfast had the charged, restless atmosphere of a town assembly held at gunpoint. Lady Constance managed it beautifully. She organized card tables, directed the footman to bring fresh flowers from the hothouse, positioned Georgiana at the pianoforte, where the light from the rain-streaked window fell across her hair like a benediction, and made certain that every guest understood the shape of the week she had planned. The Duke would sit beside Georgiana at dinner. The Duke would partner Georgiana at whist. The Duke would walk with Georgiana in the gallery when the rain made the garden impossible. The machinery was polished and public, and it required only that the Duke participate, which he did with the distant compliance of a man fulfilling a contract whose terms he had not read. Eliza kept to her duties. She brought Mrs. Bertram's shawl when the old woman called for it, poured her chocolate at the correct temperature, read aloud from a novel Mrs. Bertram had chosen for its length rather than its quality, and occupied her small chair at the edge of the room with the stillness of someone who has learned that being seen costs more than being overlooked. She did not look at the Duke. She was precise about this. She looked at the book, at the window, at Mrs. Bertram's hands folded on the counterpane, at the dog sleeping by the fire, at anything that was not the tall, quiet figure whose presence she could locate in any room without raising her eyes. Her body knew where he was. She hated this. She felt the exact distance between his shoulder and the doorway when he entered, felt the shift in the air when he crossed behind her chair, felt a warmth at the back of her neck that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the fact that he had paused, 2 steps behind her, for 3 seconds longer than passage required before continuing to the window. Lady Constance noticed. Lady Constance noticed everything. At dinner that evening, she arranged the table so that Eliza sat at the farthest end, between the rector's deaf wife and an elderly colonel who spoke only of drainage, and then turned to the assembled guests with a smile that managed to be both warm and precise. "Miss Price has agreed to play for us after dinner," she announced. "I do hope we shall not need Mrs. Bertram's little companion to turn the pages. The girl is very earnest, I grant you, and she does try. One supposes even a parson's daughter may learn to be useful in time." There was laughter. Not much. Enough? Eliza's hand tightened around the stem of her glass, and the crystal sang a single thin note that only she and the colonel heard. She did not look up. She did not flush. She set the glass down with a steadiness that cost her everything she had in that moment, and smiled at the colonel, and asked about the drainage. At the far end of the table, the Duke set down his fork. The sound was small, precise, deliberately placed, and he did not pick it up again. His eyes moved from his mother to Eliza and stayed, and in that held look there was something Eliza would not have seen even if she had been watching, because it was not meant for her. Not yet. It was meant for the room. It was a warning delivered in silence to anyone fluent in the language of a man whose rank permitted him to rearrange a table with a single word he had not yet chosen to speak. After dinner, when Georgiana played the pianoforte and the guests arranged themselves in attitudes of appreciation, Eliza stood by the window in the far corner and watched the rain stream down the glass in silver threads. She could hear every note Georgiana played, and Georgiana played well, technically precise and emotionally adequate. The performance of a woman who had been taught that accomplishment was a form of currency. The Duke stood near the pianoforte because his mother had placed him there, and his posture was correct, and his attention was on the music. And Eliza's reflection in the dark window showed her that her own hands had found each other and were gripping at the knuckles, and she released them and pressed her palms flat against her skirt and breathed. She did not see the Duke glance toward the window. She did not see his reflection find hers in the glass and hold it for 3 beats of Georgiana's sonata before he turned back to the keys. The storm pressed against the house like a living thing, and the candles bent, and the music continued, and the evening wore on in the way that evenings wear on when everyone in the room is performing a version of themselves, and the only person not performing is standing in the corner, watching rain. The fourth day of the storm brought a violence that silenced even Lady Constance. A tree came down across the east lawn at noon with a crack that shook the breakfast china, and the south wing lost 3 windows in the span of an hour. Water came through the ceiling of the blue bedroom, and the guests were moved to the upper floors while the servants worked with buckets and oilcloth and a concentrated urgency that left no room for ceremony. Eliza helped. She carried linens, held candles, and guided Mrs. Bertram up the narrow back stairs with an arm around the old woman's waist, and a calm in her voice that was not performance. That was the thing itself. The thing she was. The Duke found her in the east corridor at 3:30, carrying a stack of folded sheets toward the linen closet. Her hair had come loose from its pins on one side, and her sleeves were pushed to her elbows, and her shoes were dark with water from the flooded passage below. She looked, for the first time since he had met her, like a woman who had forgotten to be invisible. "Put those down," he said. "They need to reach the upper linen closet, Your Grace. Mrs. Lennox cannot manage the stairs with her knee, and the footmen are occupied with the windows. Put them down." She stopped. The sheets were heavy in her arms, and the corridor was dim, lit by a single candle in a wall sconce that the wind made flicker. He stood 3 paces from her, and his face was the face she had seen that first night in the library, unguarded in a way that frightened her more than the storm, because the storm would pass, and whatever was behind that face would not. "You are shaking," he said, and his voice was low. "I am cold, Your Grace. It is not significant. Sit down, here, against the wall. I will send Thomas for the linens." She sat. Not because she chose to, because her knees, which had carried her up and down the stairs 11 times since morning, chose for her. She sat against the corridor wall with the sheets in her lap and her hands flat on the linen, and her eyes closed, and the Duke of Harlow stood over her in the dim passage and said nothing for a long moment, and then he removed his coat and placed it across her shoulders, and the weight of it was warm and smelled of cedar, and something she could not name, something that belonged to the rooms of a house she would never own. He crouched beside her. His face was level with hers. The candle threw his shadow long across the stone. Eliza. He had never used her name before. The sound of it in his mouth was a new thing in the world, specific and irreversible. "Open your eyes." She opened them. "Don't close your eyes," he whispered, and his hand was near her face, not touching, not quite, his fingers at the edge of the hair that had fallen, and his voice held something that was not command, and was not plea, and was both. "Not here, not in a storm, not where I cannot see that you are all right." She understood then, in the space between his words, that he was not speaking only to her. He was speaking to someone who was not in the corridor, someone whose eyes had closed in another storm, in a carriage on a road outside London 3 years ago, while he sat in a study 20 miles away, reading a letter that did not matter. Catherine, his first wife. The woman whose portrait he had turned to the wall in the library, whose miniature he carried in the breast pocket of the coat, now draped across Eliza's shoulders. She felt its small, hard shape against her collarbone, the oval edge pressing through the wool. And the weight of it was not the weight of metal and ivory. It was the weight of a man who had carried a dead woman's face against his heart for 3 years, because putting it down would mean admitting that his hands had been empty on the night they should not have been. She had heard the story from Mrs. Lennox on the first evening, told in the housekeeper's careful, neutral voice, as though it were merely biographical. The Duchess had been traveling back from her sister's house in Surrey. The storm had come on fast. The road had washed. The carriage had overturned at a bridge 2 miles from the inn where she might have stopped. The Duke had received the news at dawn. and the household said he had not spoken for 3 days. And when he spoke again, his voice was the voice Eliza heard now, level and contained and stripped of everything that had once made it warm. She did not touch his hand. She kept her eyes open. She said, "I am here, Your Grace. I am quite all right." Something moved behind his face. Not a softening exactly. A fracture in the discipline. A hairline crack in the stone facade that the world had built its assessment on. And for one moment the Duke of Harlow looked like a man who had been carrying a house on his back and had just felt someone place a hand against the wall. He stood. He stepped away. When Thomas arrived with 2 more footmen, the Duke was at the far end of the corridor giving instructions about the south wing windows, and Eliza was on her feet with the sheets in her arms, and neither of them looked at the other. The distance between them for the rest of the evening was exact and considered and entirely unconvincing. The storm eased on the 5th morning to a gray drizzle that made the lawns steam, and Lady Constance seized the reprieve with the efficiency of a woman who had watched her plans lose 4 days to weather. She announced a small gathering in the gallery for that afternoon. Intimate, she said. Just the principal guests. A chance to see the family portraits. And she arranged the room with candles and hothouse flowers, and Georgiana in white muslin at the center of it, like a pearl, set in a jeweler's window. Eliza was not invited. She heard this from Mrs. Lennox, the housekeeper, who delivered the information with a gentleness that was itself a kind of wound, because it meant the household had noticed the exclusion and pitied her for it. "It is no matter," Eliza said. She was folding Mrs. Bertram's shawls in the 3rd-floor room, and her hands did not pause. "I have the mending to finish, and Mrs. Bertram will want her chapters read before supper." "The Dowager told Mrs. Wells at breakfast that the Duke means to offer for Miss Price before the week is out," Mrs. Lennox said. And her voice was careful. The way one is careful with a cup one suspects is already cracked. She said, and forgive me, Miss Fenwick, for I am only repeating what I heard. She said it was fortunate Mrs. Bertram's little companion knew her place, because the creature had been looking above her station, and it would not do. 3 voicings now. Private aside, public dinner, and a witnessed report in the servants' corridor delivered with the casual authority of a woman who believed her version of the world was the only version that mattered. Eliza's hand stopped. The shawl she held was cashmere, cream-colored, impossibly soft. She folded it once more with a precision that was not calmness and not anger, and was the place where the two met. "Thank you, Mrs. Lennox," she said. "I appreciate your honesty." She did not cry. She had not cried since the auction of her father's books, and she would not begin now, not for a label spoken by a woman who had never carried her own shawl. She stood at the window of her 3rd-floor room and looked out at the rain-blurred kitchen garden, and she made a decision that was not dramatic and was not defiant, and was simply the quiet, costly act of a woman who has reached the floor of her situation and found that the floor holds. She would write to the bishop's wife. She would ask for a new position in another county, far from Somerset and Harlow Park, and the gray-eyed man whose whispered words in a dark corridor had made her chest ache with a tenderness she could not afford. She would do this because she had watched her father die with his debts written in his own hand, and she had learned from that precise, devastating accounting that the only honest response to a debt one cannot pay is to name it and walk away from the table. She owed the Duke nothing. She owed herself the dignity of not waiting in corners while other women were fitted for a future she was not permitted to want. She went downstairs with the mending basket, found a chair in the empty morning room, and sat with a needle and thread and the small book of verse in her pocket. And she worked, because work was the only dignity that could not be taken by a woman in plum velvet and seed pearls. The gallery gathering was audible through the walls, the murmur of conversation, the bright thread of Georgiana's laughter, the lower register of the Duke's voice saying something she could not make out. She did not listen. She told herself she did not listen. Her hand found the book in her pocket and pressed the cover through the cloth of her dress. And the pressed violet inside shifted. She could feel it. Fragile and ancient. And still holding its color after all these years. And she thought of her mother's handwriting on the flyleaf, and the cottage that was someone else's cottage now, and the library that was someone else's shelves. And she set the needle down and pressed both palms flat on her knees, and breathed. The door opened. The Duke stood in the frame. He was breathing as though he had crossed the house at speed, and his cravat was slightly disordered, a detail so unusual on this particular man that it registered like an alarm. "Come with me," he said. "Your Grace, I do not think that is wise." "I did not ask whether it was wise. Come with me, now." She stood. She left the mending. She followed him down the corridor and through the south passage and into the gallery, where 30 people stood among the family portraits, and the hothouse flowers, and the carefully positioned candles. And every face turned when the Duke of Harlow walked in with his mother's excluded companion at his side. Lady Constance's smile did not waver. Georgiana's hand, resting on the back of a chair, tightened. The rector's wife looked at her husband. The elderly colonel adjusted his spectacles. The room held its breath with the focused attention of an audience that has sensed the program is about to deviate from the order of service. The Duke stopped in the center of the gallery, beneath the portrait of his grandfather, in the precise spot where the candlelight was strongest and the witnesses were most numerous. He turned to face the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Miss Fenwick is to be my wife." 7 words. They fell into the gallery like a stone into a pond, and the silence that followed was not the silence of shock exactly, though shock was part of it. It was the silence of recalibration, the sound a room makes when every assumption it has held for 5 days is quietly dismantled, and the architecture that remains must bear a different weight. The candles did not flicker. The rain did not pause. Somewhere in the corridor behind the gallery, a servant dropped a tray, and the clatter of silver on stone was the only sound for 4 full seconds, and then that too was absorbed by the quiet. Eliza stood beside him and did not move. Her hand was at her side, and the book of verse was in her pocket, and the pressed violet was inside the book, and her mother's maiden name was on the flyleaf, and her father's debts were 2 years paid in labor and silence, and all of these things existed in the same body that now stood in the center of a gallery, in a dove-gray dress with a pressed hem, while a duke claimed her name in front of every person who had spent the week deciding she had no name worth claiming. She did not speak. She did not need to. She stood, and she was visible. And the visibility was no longer a debt. 7 words that rearranged every assumption the room had carried for 5 days, that overturned Lady Constance's plum velvet machinery, that unseated Georgiana from the position she had occupied since the first evening, that named Eliza Fenwick, the parson's daughter with the pressed hem and the 40-pound salary, as the next Duchess of Harlow. Lady Constance opened her mouth. No sound came. She opened it again. And what emerged was not the polished sentence of a woman who had managed drawing rooms for 30 years. It was a fragment, a broken beginning. "Henry, you cannot possibly, she is not. The arrangement with Miss Price, the family has always—" "The family," the Duke said, his voice level, "will welcome her, as I do." Georgiana's hand released the chair back. Her face underwent a series of small, rapid adjustments. Surprise, then calculation, then a recognition that was not gracious exactly, but was honest, the face of a woman who had been playing a game she had assumed was already won and had just seen the board cleared. She looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back. There was a moment between them that was not warmth, and was not hostility, and was the strange mutual respect of two women who had both been managed by the same machinery and had arrived at different ends of the same evening. Mrs. Bertram, seated in a chair near the door, said, "Well, I always thought she read aloud beautifully." And the room, which had been holding its breath, released it in a sound that was not quite laughter and not quite relief, and was the beginning of a new arrangement. The rector stepped forward. The colonel nodded. Thomas, the footman, standing at the edge of the room with a tray of glasses, permitted himself the smallest shift in posture that might, in a man less disciplined, have been a smile. Eliza stood in the center of the gallery in her dove-gray dress with the pressed hem, and the Duke of Harlow stood beside her, and he did not take her hand. Not yet, not in front of 30 people, because the gesture that mattered had already been made. And what remained was the slow, warm settling of a world that had been rearranged by 7 words, spoken without raising a voice. Lady Constance sat down. Her pearls caught the candlelight one final time as her chin lowered, and she did not speak again that evening. She was not destroyed. She was displaced. As a winter is displaced by the first warm morning, not by violence, by the steady arrival of something that had been coming for longer than she had been willing to see. That night the storm returned. Gentler now. A soft, steady rain that tapped the windows of Harlow Park with the patience of an old friend asking to be let in. Eliza sat by the fire in the small sitting room on the 2nd floor, the room the Duke had told the housekeeper to prepare for her, and the book of verse lay open on her knee. The pressed violet rested on the page where her mother's favorite poem had been, and the ink of her mother's maiden name on the flyleaf was still the color of weak tea, still holding, still legible after all these years. The fire was low and orange, and made the walls amber. The rain was steady. The house creaked around her in the particular way that old houses do when they are settling into a new weight, accepting a new presence among their rooms. If Eliza's journey stayed with you, leave a quiet word about the moment that held you longest. The Duke came in without knocking. He stood at the doorway for a moment, and his hand went to his breast pocket where the miniature had lived for 3 years, and he was still for a long breath. And then he crossed the room and sat in the chair beside hers. He did not speak. He looked at the fire. She looked at the book. The violet, dislodged by the heat, lifted from the page and settled again, and Eliza pressed it flat with her fingertip. And the small gesture, her hand steady, her face quiet. The firelight on both of them was the image the room would hold after the candles were put out. Outside, the rain fell on the Somerset Hills, on the oaks that had bent and held, on the South Drive that was already beginning to dry, on the roof of a great house where a woman who had been invisible had been named, and the naming had made the house a different house, and the storm, which had broken every rule for them, was passing now, gently, over the fields that would be green by morning. The book was still open. The violet held its color. And Eliza Fenwick, who had learned to fill the shape of a life that was not quite a life, sat beside the man who had seen her, in a room that was now hers, and did not close her eyes.